Welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk about research methods. So the outcomes for this video or this topic would be to answer some questions related to the objectives of science, why scientists do research, then how they attain these objectives, like the method of science. Then we'll talk about how they conduct research, which is about the actual methodology the researchers often use when doing research or when trying to find answers to the questions. So let's get to the first, let's get to the basic idea, a big picture of science. Now, so researchers ask questions about the population, and the questions they ask are related to the population. An example would be, what percentage of people in the US favor death penalty? So the question is about people in the US, and the question is specifically about people's opinion about death penalty. So people's opinion about death penalty can be called a variable, which will vary from place to place, or it's a variable. A variable is something that changes from place to place, or person to person, or from time to time. So one's opinion about death penalty is such variable. And the question asked here is, how many, what percentage of individuals in the US favor death penalty? So questions are about population, in this case the population in the US, and the questions are about either a variable or about the relationship between two variables. In this case, in this question, the question is about a variable. The variable here is the opinion, people's opinion, or favorability of death penalty. Now, one way to actually answer this question is to actually collect data from all the individuals in a given population. Then calculate what percentage of these individuals actually are in favor, and you have your answer to the question. We do that. It's time consuming. It's doable. We often do that, especially in a census where we collect data from all the individuals in a given community. But you can't keep asking questions, and it's just not economical. So you need to have a different methodology to answer questions. So what researchers do is they select a sample that represents the population of your interest. The population of interest here is the people in the US. And when they select a random sample that is representative of the population, and they ask this question, and they take their opinion about whether they favor or not the death penalty. So each individual will answer the question, do you favor death penalty? Yes, no. Let's assume that 65% of those individuals are in favor. So in this sample, say 650 out of 1,000 individuals said they are in favor of death penalty. That means that for this sample, what percentage of individuals are in favor of death penalty? The answer is 65%. But keep in mind, this is about the sample. Although it is representative of the population, this is not the actual number in the population. For instance, if you take another random sample and of 1,000 individuals and ask them the same question, then you may not exactly get 650 individuals saying they're in favor. Maybe it will change to 60%, maybe 59, maybe 68. From sample to sample, the values change. So the value you get here is specific to the sample that you have randomly selected. And this variability between samples is called sample variability or sampling variability. Now, what researchers do is they use statistics or probability to estimate the population values based on these sample values. So the sample value here for that given sample was 65%. Now they use this magic of stats and probability, and if you want to learn more about it, you should probably take stats or research methods class in the psychology department. So with these sample values, they estimate the population values with a certain confidence and say that, well, we are 95% confident that the percentage of people who are in favor of death penalty is somewhere between 60 and 70, which is in a range. And it's not the exact number because there is no way to find out the exact number, but with certain confidence, you can estimate the population values lying in a specific range of values. And thus you got an answer. Well, 60 to 70% is a higher percentage. So you say, well, a lot of individuals, around 60 to 70% of individuals are in favor of death penalty. Again, this is made up data. This is not the actual data. I just want you to be aware of that. So what do scientists do? They ask questions. They do research. In other words, they ask questions and find answers. And why do they ask questions and seek answers? Well, that's about objectives of science. So there are at least 4 different objectives of science. The first one is to describe something. In this case, to describe a behavior. And when you describe a behavior, you are collecting information objectively and trying to describe a particular phenomenon of interest, or the observation. Or when there are 2 or more variables, the objective of the scientist would be to actually find the relationship between the 2 variables, so that when you know the value of one variable, you know the value of the other variable. So this objective is called prediction. A good example would be the relationship between the ACT scores or SAT scores and the college GPA. Remember when you applied to get into college, you were supposed to, most of the universities require students to take either ACT or SAT, right? The reason is that there is enough evidence, the information that's collected so far suggests that higher ACT scores are related to higher GPA. In general, people with higher ACT scores, they do well in college. And people with lower ACT scores, they don't do as well in college. So there is a kind of relationship between these 2, so that by knowing the value of one variable, in this case your ACT score, universities kind of make this prediction saying this is how much you'll score, how you will do in college. So that's why they base their admissions on your ACT or SAT scores. So this way, this method or this objective is to find the relationship between 2 variables in this case. So when you know the values of one variable, your ACT scores, you can actually predict the values of your GPA. But keep in mind, it's not your ACT score that is the reason why you either have a higher or a lower GPA. There could be other factors called confounding factors or other variables that were not taken into account. In this case, maybe you are a hard worker. Because you're a hard worker, you had higher ACT, then you also had a higher GPA. So association does not imply causation, suggesting that just because 2 variables are related, it does not mean that they are associated, does not mean that one causes the other. The third kind of the objective science is to explain a behavior. In this case, it's not just about how related 2 variables are. It's about how whether one variable causes the other variable, where X causes Y. And that objective is called explanation. We can explain a behavior only by knowing the causes. Then once we know the causes, well, this is the basic research. You can actually control a behavior. That's the applied aspect of the applied objective of science. So at a basic level, to give you generally, the objective of science is, especially psychology, is to either to predict a behavior, either to describe a behavior or predict a behavior, to explain a behavior or to control a behavior. And you can control a behavior when you know the causal factors underlying the particular behavior. Now, the second question was about what is the process of conducting research? Well, when researchers have a question, um, they they specify the question and then they develop what is called as a research question. So step one would be to develop a research question. Step two is to frame a research hypothesis, and step three is to gather information, to test the hypothesis, and then draw conclusions about the research question. Typically, when you have a research question, you have a question based on already existing theory, or based on your observations, or based on your experience, or based on some common beliefs in a given culture, or things like that. And when you develop a question, then you also will go by these things one at a time. So the question you develop, as we discussed earlier, the research questions are about population, and they're about a variable in the population, or about two or more variables and their relationship in the population. So for example, an example of a one variable question would be the prevalence of smoking behavior in the US. So there is only the population is US, people in the US, and the variable of interest is the smoking behavior. So your question is about the frequency, how many, what percentage of individuals in the US smoke. So this is a research question with one variable. Or you may have a research question with two variables. Now you can ask the same, another example of a research question is the majority of the US in favor of death penalty? Right? It's basically asking a question about what percentage of people in the US are in favor of death penalty. Now you can have a certain cut point and say, well, if it's 60% above, it's majority, and if it's below, then it's minority. So again, the population here is people in the US, and the variable of interest here is opinions about death penalty. Well, we can also have questions related to variables. For example, you may be interested in finding the relationship between gender and memory. Let's call one variable x1, the other variable x2. So then you ask a question like, are gender and memory related? Or you can ask a question like, are females different in memory than males? Or if you think that females have higher memory, you may also ask a question like, do females have better memory than males? Again, keep in mind there are two variables here. Number one is the memory, the other variable is the gender. Now, once you frame your research question in terms of a single variable, two variables, or multiple variables, then you frame a research hypothesis. Now, a research hypothesis is your tentative answer to your research question, right? For example, are males and or gender and memory related? You probably think that they are related. That's why you asked this question in the first place. So research hypothesis is your guess about the research question written in a format that you can test it. So in the research hypothesis, you actually make predictions either about one variable or relationship between two or more variables. So in the example for our memory and gender related, your research hypothesis would be that females would score higher than on a memory test than males. Or you may just say females' memory would be different from males' memory on a memory test. Again, keep in mind, what you're basically doing is you're trying to see if a particular variable, which is memory, is different for the two conditions of the other variable, which is males and females, of the variable called gender. So you have research question, thus you develop research hypothesis or prediction, and these come from your hypothesis, your research question in the first place. They all either come from your existing beliefs or your knowledge of things or your experience, your observation, or already existing theories in the field. And the third step, once you have a question and you develop a research hypothesis, then you need to test your hypothesis. Well, for example, let's assume you asked a question, are memory and gender related? Then you hypothesize that they are actually related such that the memory for males, memory for females would be higher than memory for males. Then what you need to do is, the third step is you need to test a hypothesis. And this is the important point, this is the important method, and we'll talk about different ways of gathering evidence or testing your hypothesis. So what you do here is you'll collect information about one variable if it's just about one variable, right? Remember, you randomly select a sample and you ask them whether they smoke or not, right? You get the sample value, and from there you make conclusions with the population if it's one variable. If it's two variables, then you pretty much do the same thing, where you calculate the values of memory for the two levels of the other variable, which is male and female, for the variable called gender, from a sample, as opposed to collecting information from the entire population, as we discussed earlier. And this value you get, let's say 59% people in the US smoke, or let's assume that females' memory is higher than males in the sample. Let's say the sample values are such that females have memory of 10 points more than males in a given sample. Well, keep in mind these values are for the sample. Now you need to, these are sample results, you need to be able to make conclusions about the population, right? That brings us to the next step. So example, before we go to the next step, let's take the example. Memory score, participants, both males and females, randomly selected from a group of population. They were given a memory test for one group, which is males, the other group is females. Let's assume you randomly selected 120 students from this class, and a sample results are such that females scored higher. The average score of females is more than males by 10 points overall. But keep in mind, this difference of 10 points is in the sample that is selected. But the question we have is about the population. So the fourth step is to draw conclusions about the population based on your sample values. And these conclusions you make are the answers to the research question. And the conclusions you make are using statistics. It is assuming that if there was no difference between males and females in their memory, what is the probability or the likelihood that you find the difference that you found, which is 10 points difference, by chance? And based on that chance probability value, you determine an answer to your research question. So if the probability of finding the difference you found, which is of difference of 10, is very low, say 1%, the probability that you find a difference of 10 points, if there is no actual difference between males and females in the population, if it's as low as 1%, which is p equal to 0.01, which is very low, but you still got this difference, suggesting that there is in fact some difference in the population between males and females. This value is called p-value, the likelihood value of finding the difference you found if there was no effect of gender on memory. Then you make a conclusion based on that probability value, whether yes, females have higher memory than males, Or let's say the difference of 10 points, so the p-value, the probability of finding it by chance was, say, it was 0.10, like 10%. If there was no difference between males and females in their memory, then there are chances are 10% of the time you'll find the difference. Well, that's higher a chance, right? So the difference you found could be just a matter of chance. There may not be an actual difference in the population between males and females memory. In that case, you can say, no, females don't have higher memory than males, but that's not the right thing to say. You only collect, you only test your hypothesis, which is that there is a difference between the two. If you don't find a difference, does not mean that there is no difference. It's just that the sample you've collected and the data you've collected is not sufficient to either support or reject the hypothesis, which is that these two are related. So rather you say, well, no, we don't have enough evidence to conclude that males females have higher memory than males, or gender and memory are related.